So welcome here to today's workshop. So basic idea here, we have spent the last three classes working through hierarchical time series, where you have basically a forecast that could apply to a number of different subtopics, okay? So in our particular example, we have COVID cases. And so there's the country level forecast, and then there are the 50 individual states. Okay, so the idea is, right, the high level forecast can be broken down into the 50 individual forecasts. And so it is a common issue that's used, that gets approached quite a bit. There's actually not a lot of explicit coverage about it. And so kind of like we were discussing before we recorded, it is actually fairly common, you know. So if you have like 8,000 servers or a fleet of 6,000 vehicles or 10,000 events or whatever, right? And you sort of need to make some useful way to make reasonable predictions. There's not a lot out there, so here we are. So let's go ahead. If you just want to go and take a look at the slides, we will start with that. And then you should be able to have them inside the Slack channel. If you all want to take a look, just make sure we're good. Okay. All right. So let's kind of do a little bit of recap. Actually, neither of you were at the previous class. Okay. So it might be worthwhile to do a little bit of catch up here. And then we can make sure we have some of the previous material if you want to look at it as a refresher, although it should be in all the Slack channels. All right, so basic idea, previous class, what we did, we took a top level forecast of total COVID cases, which gave us a mean average percent of around 0.2 to 0.1 to 0.2, meaning that for daily cases of COVID, when we actually predicted how many cases there were going to be, it was within about 10 to 20%. We did that previously in classes, and then we spent the previous two classes pretty much taking that forecast and then projecting it down into the individual states. And so basic idea is what we did is we started with a single forecast for the entire United States, and then we used that forecast and then broke it down into the different proportions for each of the individual 50 states. Okay, is everyone there? So we had like one forecast, and then we split it up 50 different ways. So kind of a top-down approach. And then basically what we did is we looked at three different ways of kind of coming up with the proportions for each of the individual states. All right, so Rishab, the first class, well, I think you attended here, basically what we did is for the proportions, we actually built a model to predict the daily proportions for each of the individual states. Okay, and so where we actually came up with that was the top level forecast accuracy was around 0.2. The state level weighted forecast accuracy was about twice as bad. Okay, so the idea then, our forecast for COVID-19 for the US was a bit more accurate than our forecast for the proportions. The next class that we looked at right over here is we basically tried out two different variations of this. We just took the historical average of the state's proportions and then use that instead. So the idea is instead of sort of having something that was dynamic, where you know, day by day, kind of like the proportional values of each state fluctuated, we just sort of said the state of New York historically has accounted for you know, 18% of total COVID-19 cases. And so basically what we did is we just took the state level forecast and then just multiplied that by 0.18 for New York and just kind of applied that through every single day. This performed worse because just the idea is it's probably a bit too blunt. And then if you were to go back through the individual slides from the previous workshop, where it really ran into problems is in the northeastern states that got the cases very, very early, they were being really, really, really over-predicted. All right, so New York would be a good example. So like historically, New York has maybe accounted for about 10% of total COVID-19 cases. If you look at typical caseloads today, it's closer to probably about 1 or 2%. Okay, and so taking something like 0.10 or you know, 10 or 11% and just sort of bluntly applying that for all of these states ended up being, we are predicting about 2,000 to 3,000 cases for every single one of those states when it was about twice or a third as small. Okay, so it turns out that ended up just kind of killing the values, and so it ended up being less accurate overall. And then where we wrapped up class looking at is something in between. And so what we did is we looked at the last day of the test set And then starting at that day, we took the 14-day moving average of state proportions. Okay, so essentially, sort of, if you look at the average proportion of all COVID-19 cases each state had, and sort of blended that over that value of the last 14 days, and we used that as the projected value, it actually ended up giving us the best results. Okay, and so that kind of gave us the close match. I think those results are actually fairly intuitive. So a moving average is somewhat dynamic, so it captures previous movements up to the present day. However, though, it's maybe not too clever for its own good. Okay, because one thing we had with forecasting the individual proportions was that a lot of states just don't have a lot of unique data. So profit tends to work best when you have ideally a couple years worth of data. So that way you can have quarterly and annual components and trends and things along those lines. We don't have that already. So we're kind of have like our hands tied behind our back a little bit. And then for a lot of states that have just recently gotten some of their caseloads going, there's actually only maybe no more than 30 to 60 to 90 days of actually hard data. So it turns out for cases, for states that had more recent caseloads, or just ones where there are generally low case levels, the values for those tended to actually be quite inaccurate. Okay, so actually the problems with the forecasted proportions and the historical average proportions were exactly opposite. The historical averages were radically over-predicting stuff that had large caseloads previously, like New York or Rhode Island or New Jersey, because the caseloads they have today just don't really match up to what they had historically. But also, if you're forecasting states that had big flare-ups most recently or just not a lot of data at all, actually tend to be fairly inaccurate. So it turns out this one, where we left off the class with, ended up giving us the best results. And that's kind of where we're leading up to today. Okay. So basic idea here now, what we're going to be doing next is looking at the bottom-up approach, where essentially what you do is you build your individual forecasts, and then you aggregate them up into the top level. So a lot of the basic mechanics are about the same, but the trade-offs are a little bit inverted. So basic idea, so instead of just fitting one forecast for COVID-19 and then projecting it downward, we're going to do the exact opposite. We're going to go ahead and actually build forecasts for each of the individual 50 states, and then go ahead and then sum them together in different ways. All right. So this ultimately gives you a lot more control. So if you want something that's going to ultimately give you the most power in order to sort of adjust things, bottom up is going to be the best, but it takes longer to fit. And it's also more time consuming, because essentially what you have to do is you have to pinpoint and build unique forecasts for all 50 states if you wanted to. Okay, we're going to do that automatically, kind of like in more of sort of a programmatic way. But if you're really inclined, you could actually build separate forecasts for each of your 50 states and kind of hand tune things in different ways. So, but let's go ahead and take a look. All right. So here, let's go ahead and begin, everyone. If you have a notebook open, if you want to go ahead and just import this and start going.
Jonathan, are you sharing your screen?
Maybe I'm not. No. All right, so let me go ahead. All right. Yeah, if I forget to do that, Tyler, especially if you're new here, feel free just to, if it's obvious I'm making some sort of mistake, then don't worry about being polite and just, okay. Because I am prone to doing that. And sometimes if you don't say it, I can just go on, for quite some time before it sinks in. So, all right, I think we're probably, can everyone see now?
Yeah.
Yes? So you see a slide, import pandas SPD?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to walk through these slides, provide some context, and then I will periodically check, just to make sure everyone's at the same spot so we can keep going. Okay. So give it a minute. And then also what I'll do here, probably for some of the more generic stuff, I'll just paste it in Slack to allow things to go a bit more quickly. All right, so we okay with pandas, NumPy, and profit? Do we have this? This is okay, fairly straightforward at this point. Let me get this thing. Okay, let's go ahead. I'll paste the URL in the Slack if you want to go ahead and load it in. We're using data from the COVID tracking project. Okay, so you would put that line into pd.read_CSV. And then just as a quick heads up, especially Tyler, if you haven't been to the previous two classes and they weren't recorded, so maybe you couldn't see it in real time, I think it's generally true. Some of the actual operations you have to perform in pandas to actually sort of like take a top level forecast and project it down or go in the other direction. It can be a little, I would say, intermediate to advanced in terms of what you have to do. Because you have to do a lot of grouping and merging to kind of like take a number and sort of project it down and vice versa and things like that. So actually, if you're in the class, it actually took us, the second class, actually about 1 hour just to walk through a single example of how to kind of like go from a top level number and like break it down to like 50 different ways, just because you have to group and merge in different ways. And so kind of getting like a top level metric and breaking it down all the different ways you have to. It's probably nothing you haven't done before, but it can just, it's a little tedious. All right, so, but in any event here, do we have this? Some DF, and so we have basically day level forecasts and then our individual states right over here?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So real quickly here, let's kind of go ahead. For the uninitiated, right, so dates is just the, the date, obviously the state. Positive increase basically tells you how many new cases were there that particular day. So if we're going to predict day-by-day COVID cases, this is a column that would tell us this. And also just real quickly here, again, a little bit of context here. For profit, it actually requires the date column to be called DS and the positive increase column to be called Y. Just as a quick heads up, that's why we're doing this. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and just sort of start up a notebook here pretty quickly. So give me 1 minute here. Oh, what am I? Okay, with, it's probably that right there. All right, so. All right, and so let me go ahead and then just get this. I'm just going to do a little bit of copying and pasting here. Just give me 1 minute. All right, just to make sure we're clear with all of this. All right, and so just real quickly here, so we should have something like this: DS, state, and Y. Good?
Yeah.
Okay, beautiful. All right. Okay, all right, so moving ahead here, let's do a quick look here. So, all righty. So something we took, this is a detail that we covered previously. For this particular data set, it has an issue where maybe the first month or so is basically just zero filled, and then there are no cases at all. And so if you're doing the individual state level forecasts, it can be a little troublesome just because there's already sparse data to begin with for a lot of these states with low caseloads. And so basically what we're going to do here is just cut off. We're going to start our time series when there was the first recorded case. Okay, so let's just take a look. Here, I'll go ahead and then paste this into my notebook so we can take a look at it. So here, right, this is our data set. So our individual states and Y. Okay, so essentially what we're doing here is we're saying for every single day, here are many states where, and again, if you just look at this, if you look at the very, very beginning of the time series, it's almost entirely zero filled. So this really is not very informative because literally nothing had really been measured yet. So all we're doing here, okay, just passing in over here, getting our index like this, and then we're just going to filter out these values that have zero values whatsoever. There are a few ways you could do this, but here's just one we can do. So what we're going to do here is just get the index. So if you want to go ahead and take this, make sure you have it in. And again, all we're doing are getting the index values where there's more than 0 cases. Okay, and then if you were just to look, from January 22nd to February 28th, there were just no recorded values at all. So essentially our time series is going to begin from February 29th and it's going to end September 30th. All right. And so a quick check. Do we have this? Okay, beautiful. All right. So moving ahead then. All right, so all we just did is just saved this as so just saving the index as a variable, and then just make sure we're clear with this, right? We're just doing a query, and so saying wherever, right, the DS column is in, right, these values right over here, we're just going to go ahead and then filter it on that. All right, so the basic idea then is once you're done with this, all right, you should basically just have the data set should begin February 29th, and then it just proceeds monotonically until it would be October 1st today, I think, depending on the values, right? But it should go to the very, very end like that. Okay, and again, we're just clipping off where those values are 0. Okay, so we get that basic step. And again, for the top level time series, you could probably do something like this, but again, with the bottom level time series, the forecast, you already have the issue with insufficient data and irregular pattern. That just tends to make it even worse. So we're just going to go ahead and clip it off. All right, so let's go ahead here. Rishab, you may remember this, this function, build hierarchical forecast. So it's just a little bit of an easy way to define a variable and just sort of say for every single unique value of that column, build a separate forecast for it. Okay. Tyler, this might be a little bit new for you. I mean, maybe if you would have seen this in the notes right over here, but we're just going to walk through it very quickly. So the idea is this function takes in 3 arguments, df, which is just a data frame, level var, this is the column that contains the unique values that you want to go ahead and use to build your different forecasts for. So in our case, this would be state. Okay, so if you go back to your own notebook, right, we essentially want to build a forecast for each of our individual 50 states right over here. So that is basically what this argument right over here would represent. And then date underscore IDX, this is just a date index that we're going to create for all the days that we want to go ahead and then build forecasts for. Okay. And I'll just kind of, you'll be able to use this here in a minute, but the idea is we create an empty data frame with the date index. We get the unique values of the column. So in this case, what this would look like would be this. Right, so we're getting all the 50 values for states right over here like this. And then what we're doing next, okay, is we are looping through all 50 of our states. And then for each one of these, we're initializing an instance of profit. These parameters right over here, these parameters were defined in previous classes. So essentially, we're just using the hyperparameter values from class 1. All right, that's where they're coming from. And so essentially what we're doing then, so for every single state, initialize an instance of profit, filter the data frame where the values are just for that particular state right over here. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and then we're going to fit it. And then we're going to go ahead and then make our predictions. And so the predictions for each of the individual 50 states are actually going to be displayed as their own separate column inside of a data frame. Okay. This is what we used 2 classes ago. So Rashab, you saw this. Tyler, you might be looking at this for the very, very first time. But what we're going to do here is modify this a little bit. And so for this particular class, all right, we're just going to make these modifications. And so the idea then, all right, again, this came from the first 2 classes where we looked at the impact of holidays on COVID-19, and then also, the ideal value for the change point prior scale and things like that. So again, we fit the top level forecast and did some cross validation. And so what we're doing here is we're just sort of taking those settings and then we're just sort of starting with that right over here. And so same thing, essentially what we're doing is we are creating an individual forecast for each of the 50 states using these values. What we're going to do here, let's just go ahead. I'll put it in the Slack channel if we just want to just take that for now. And again, during the lab, if you have any questions in terms of what we're doing. All right, let's just start with this. All right. All right, so do that and let's just make sure we have it in our notebook. It's actually nice having someone with their video on because it's very convenient just to be able to monitor people's facial expressions. You can tell a lot just in terms of if everyone's ready. So, but I'll take it. We're good? Okay, beautiful, beautiful. All right. All right, so again, this is the same function that we had before. It's just modified for our own purposes, and we just set different model parameters. All right, and then this here is our date range, right? So the beginning of the time series is February 29th, and then the end, we're just going to define as being September 30th. Let's go ahead and do this. All right. And then what we're doing here, right, is just defining a training and a test set. And so essentially, we're going to find the test set just to be the last 2 weeks of the time series. That's basically it right over here. All right. So I'll give us a minute. And again, I'll put this one in Slack too. I don't think it's especially, if you've taken that or if you're working as an analyst, you should be pretty okay with these things. Let's just go here. Okay. Okay, so we should have 2 variables, right? df train, df test, and then df train is just the beginning of the time series up until 2 weeks ago. And then we have the test set right over here. All right, and let's go. Okay, so what we're going to do here, let's just go ahead and then call the function, okay? So I'll give us a minute. It takes a few minutes to fit. All right. Is this fitting? You should sort of see, fitting model for XYZ thing. So is it running? Okay. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and just get some of these things going inside my own notebook. So it'll take a little bit of time. So if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and then. I actually think there is a print function in the middle of this that's probably excessive. I think I was just troubleshooting a few things to make sure it came out correctly. You could probably get rid of that if you wanted to, but whatever, it'll still work the same way. All right, and then let me go back and just make sure I have all this. I should be able to do this myself. Hold on. All right, that works. All right, so let me get this right over here. And then let me go ahead and run it. And then for you, it's probably pretty close to being done right now. And for me, it's just going to get started. I'll give it a minute here to go ahead and run. Blah, blah, blah. Here we go. All right. All right. So you all are probably there. I'd imagine it's about done fitting. For you all? Okay. All right. We'll give it just one more minute here, and then we'll keep going after that. And then I'm going to turn on the light so that way it doesn't just turn pitch black in my living room. All right, so let's go ahead. All right, so, okay, so we basically have 56 different forecasts. And then if you take a look, you should have the data frame with like, it's basically gonna be something like 100 and, or like 300 rows and about 50 columns. And that's pretty much your predicted values for each of the individual states. So we basically like initialize profit, fit the time series, and then predict for each of our 50 states. And then, so what's going to come up next here? All right, real quickly here, let's take a look at a few things. I think mine is almost done. Okay, but for everyone else, if you do this, right, and then just sum across the individual rows, that would basically give you your top level forecast. All right, so aggregating from each of the 50 subcomponents up to the top would not be too difficult. It would just be that. All right, and then when I'm done, I can show it to you here pretty quickly. I only have 2 more states to fit. So it's almost done. Let me get it finished. Okay, it's done. Yeah. So anyways, right? So state prids, right? We have our date right over here. We have our 50 states right over here. By the way, just everyone, so, Prophet is a little particular about what it can make predictions for. And so in this case, because we have these shallow time series, for the first 8 rows, there is basically just not enough data to generate a useful prediction. But if we go through over here, all right, right, so we have 50 states and then 50 different predictions, predictions for all 50 of them right over here. And so the idea then, right, if we just sum across the rows, all right, these would basically be our individual, this would basically be the aggregate forecast, all right? It is generally true, if you're doing this different hierarchical forecasting, you'll be more accurate the closer you are to the level of whatever it is you're looking at. So in this case, state level predictions individually might be more accurate than the top-down way, but when we sort of aggregate them together into like the higher forecast, we'll be a little further off, where if you go top-down, it would be the exact opposite. The top-level forecast would be pretty good, but when you go down to the individual states, some information will be lost. So in any event, going from one to the other, so going from the states to the top is really not all that difficult if you do it this way. It's just one function call. And then real quickly here, let's just take a quick look. If you want to do a little bit of visualization, all right, if you just take, right, state prids.sum, axis equal to 1, and call plot, that'll give you a quick visual description of the time series that we have. All right. And then if you just want to do like a quick diagnostic, right? So this is the plot of our predictions. This is the plot of COVID-19 itself. All right. And so it looks fairly coherent in the sense that it seems to match the overall pattern pretty well. Only thing you'll notice, if you want us to take a look, all right, notice here, Prophet basically just takes the most recent trend and then just projects it into the future, like this right over here. And then we have kind of like this little uptick right over here like this. Something that'll be discussed in the lab a little bit. Essentially, Prophet, when it's fitting your time series, stops 8/10 of the way through. So it looks at the first 80% and then just projects afterwards. The idea is that prevents it from overfitting. If you have a very, very short time series like we have, where it's really just 6 months worth of data, and then things are markedly erratic, that actually might not be the ideal setting. So something you can change to see if it gives you better results, to sort of say like go up to the first 90% or 95% or what have you. Normally it's not a bad idea. Like that's actually a reasonable setting in the beginning with the 0.8. But this actually might be an instance where it'd be useful to make an exception to see if we get better results. And you can kind of see here as well. It actually doesn't really capture the most recent change in direction. We kind of have this pivot right over here, whereas Prophet just kind of keeps on trucking downward direction like that. All right, so that is something, a knob we could tweak if we wanted to. All right, and then you'll be asked to do that in the lab to see if it improves the results or not. But in any event, make sure, so we have these two plots, right, visually, our predicted values and the actual one, to kind of see how they match. And they're somewhat coherent, but we don't capture the most recent trend. Okay. Que pasa, everyone?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good. Okay. All right. So the idea then, top level forecasts. All right. Let's take a look at predictions on the test set. All right. So what we should have here, okay, so pretty much dates going from September 16th all the way to September 30th for each of the individual 50 states. This is the test set. All right. In a lot of ways, this is the hard part about doing these things. And this is where the pandas operations you have to do can actually be fairly tricky. Okay, so it can take a little bit of time. And lots of times when people have to do this on their own, it actually does take a while just to get some of the steps built up in your own mind. Let's take a look. Hey, I think we have someone else and someone new here. Let's take a quick look. All right, here comes Ricardo. Hi, welcome, Ricardo. All right, happy to have you here. Thanks for making it. All right, so everyone else, let's kind of keep on going here. Ricardo, when we get a chance to take a break, I will go ahead and then just sort of give you the notebook if you want to run through some things. All right, so we have the test set right over here, okay? So this is essentially what we're going to do to go ahead and then validate our predictions against. All right. And then this are a collection of the individual predictions for each of the 50 states day by day. All right. I think we got someone else here. Okay. All right. Sounds good. All right. So this is where it can be complicated, right? So we have predictions for all 50 states with the date right over here. All right. And then also what we have, right, is the test set. And an important detail, the test set is formatted differently than this, okay? So kind of going from this to make it agreeable with this right over here is actually fairly, in my opinion, fairly difficult, okay? And it's definitely something you have to do probably 3 to 5 times to get the hang of it. So let's kind of work through it right now. And so we're gonna look at some fairly useful pandas functions for shaping your data. All right, so let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and then run this command, testprids.melt. All right, and then let's take a look to see what it does. All right, so this one is fairly tricky, okay? It's maybe not obvious what this thing is doing, but the idea is melting, what it does, it allows you to take a number of different states right over here, or rather a number of different columns, and then collapse them into one. Okay, so the basic idea here is here where we have one date, right, for September 16th, 2020. And then we have 50 different columns right over here. Okay, essentially what we're doing is we're saying take these 50 different columns and then collapse them into individual rows. Okay, so what we're doing then, we're going from having one row and 50 columns, okay, to having just one column and 50 rows like this. All right, let's do a quick check. It's actually, it can be a little tricky, but it's often useful for these sorts of things. All right, so Tyler's nodding his head like he is good. And then I know Ricardo, we've discussed melt a few times, but it's done. Rishab, are you in good shape? Okay.
Sorry, I was on mute, but I'm okay.
No, it's okay. All right, yeah. So melting is very, very useful for reshaping your data set. And just the big thing is here, so now our variable testprids, and then this thing called df test, they are formatted the same way. And so now if we want to make comparisons between the two, it'll be a lot more convenient. All right, that's the big thing. So if we have this right over here, so test underscore prids.melt, id underscore vars, ds, value name, var name, whatever. Those are different. The value name, right, is just the name of the column right over here. And then the var name is just for all the columns that we're collapsing, what do we want the corresponding label to be? So let's go ahead. Just take that last line, just make sure you have it saved as a variable. All right, and then next thing we're going to go ahead and do, all right, we're just going to go ahead and now combine the two of these things together, okay? So take a look, right? So each of these things have columns called DS and state. So we're saying here, take the test set and then merge it with the predictions. And then what we should have as a result, right, is for all 50 states, we have the individual day. We have the true value right over here, and then we have the predicted value right over here. Okay, so the idea is once we have this, coming up with error terms and then different types of metrics will be a lot more straightforward. All right, so if we have this, let's go ahead and just save it as a variable. And let's make sure we're okay. Okay. Does anyone need to go back? Right, you should have df test, so ds state, and then you have the true answer right over here, and then you have the predicted answer right over here.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So moving ahead. All right. So what we're going to do here, so the idea is if every single row you have the prediction and then the true observation itself, it makes various types of error calculations a lot more straightforward. So what we're going to do here, we're just going to go ahead and get the absolute error. So just go ahead and take y minus the prediction, take the absolute value, and just make that into its own column. All right, so just go ahead and then do this. And then if we go on to the next step here, all right, this is where it can be a little, okay, little tricky. Let's kind of go ahead. Let's go ahead and type in these lines right over here. All right, I'll give us a minute, and then you can just let me know if there's something you're not confused about. But basically what we're doing is we're getting the total number of cases for each state, and then we are getting the total amount of error for each state right over here as well. And then we're just dividing the two. So the idea is for the amount of error, what percent of the total was it? And that's going to give us a fairly, in some ways, it's maybe not always the most informative and statistically valid way of measuring how good your model is. It is definitely, though, one of the best ways of just interpreting how well you're doing very quickly. So it's not really fancy, but essentially, for whatever the value is, by what percent were you off by? That's basically what this number tells us. Okay. Right. So essentially, what we're going to do then, I'll just real quickly here, I can go ahead and get this in my own notebook because I have it here. So if we group by the date and then we get y right over here, or rather it would be state, excuse me. We'd want to do state. Let me just make sure I actually have that in my, does it say state inside the notebook, hopefully? Yeah, okay, got it. Yeah, so the basic idea is, right, so for each state, this is the total number of cases inside the test set. And then, right, we look at this one, this column should basically tell us the total amount of error. Okay, and then you just divide the two. And so for every single state, take the total amount of cases and then the total amount of error that we have, and that will just tell you how much of a percentage our total amount of errors we're off by. So it's just kind of, you could potentially use more sophisticated things, but it's kind of a quick look measure of how good you're doing. It's actually, it's very, very interpretable. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead. So the idea is, everyone, you should have something that looks like this, right? With each of the individual states. Okay. And then we have the mean average percent error right over here with varying numbers. All right. So do we have some variable looking like this? Okay, all right. So the idea is for each individual states, pretty much how accurate were our typical predictions as a matter of total percent. And so we can see here, we're kind of all over the map a little bit. All right. So real quickly here, notice this right over here, the total error is infinity. That's because AS has never had a recorded case. So what we're going to do here is just drop that one because doing operations with the infinity number is actually fairly difficult. So, and then we're dividing by 0 over here. So the state totals had a 0, so that gave us this infinity error. So just to make some things a little bit more simple, we're just going to go ahead and drop that one. You could also set it to 0 if you wanted to. So basically a few different ways you could do this. All right, and so the idea then, let's get rid of this. And then if we go on to the next set right over here, so if we just take the simple average of this, we can see it comes out to 0.64. All right, which in many ways, to me, actually doesn't sound all that great. Like we're typically off by 64%. However, though, one issue we're going to run into, this is an average, right, for each of our individual states. It doesn't really say anything, though, about how many cases each of these individual states have. All right, so the idea then, if we have a state that maybe has 15 cases per day on average, and we're predicting 25, maybe that's not super consequential in terms of how much we're off by, but in terms of NAPE, it's going to look like a big ugly number. Okay, and so sometimes if we just take the simple average, right? Hawaii probably just doesn't have a lot of COVID-19 cases. And so my guess is if we were to look at the individual caseloads, there's probably something like 35 cases a day, and then we're predicting 65 or 70 or something like that. So a lot of times you could actually look at this individually to see how accurate every single forecast is for each of the individual states. But sometimes, though, if we kind of have to tie this together to some sort of useful aggregate, it can be useful to take a weighted average versus just the simple average right over here. So that way states like Texas, Florida, California, which have disproportionately large numbers of cases, will actually be given their fair share. Okay, because in this case, we're not really accounting for that at all. So what we're going to do, we're going to do some more grouping. All right. So take a look at this right over here, right? So just go ahead and then sum up this column. So excuse me, it would look, so state totals right over here, this variable. Okay, all we're just going to do, excuse me here, is just go ahead and then sum it up. This will just give us the total number of cases in our test set. All right, and then the idea then, right, so the number should come out to 640,000 if we're on the same page there. Tyler, you're pretty much my litmus test for everyone's doing because I can see your face. Okay, so we have some number, it's 640,000. So in our test set from September 15th to September 30th, this is the total number of COVID-19 cases that we had. All right, so the idea then, if you take our state totals and then divide it by the total, this will just give us the proportion of each of the individual states, right? So this will tell us, right? So California has about 8%. I think Texas, if you look at it, has something around 12, right? Something along those lines. So this will just allow us just to have a slightly better measure of how much of the total each state is contributing. All right, and so we can see here, right, some of these things where we're off by are also cases where maybe they just don't really contribute a lot of to begin with. So they might not be very accurate, but it's also true they might not be very important in the grand scheme of things. All right, so let's go ahead here. So the idea then, right, we have the proportion of the total for each of the individual states. And so now what we can do, so same thing, drop AS simply because it's a nuisance and it has 0 cases and it screws up the arithmetic. So let's give it to this one. All right. So the idea then, if we take the proportions and then multiply it by the MAPE and sum that together, this would essentially be the weighted average across all of our 50 states once we account for how much each state contributes to the overall total. So in terms of a single holistic measure, this might actually be a bit more informative. So it accounts for the fact that if we're inaccurate, for a state like Texas or Florida, it'll count for proportionally more than if we're off in Hawaii or Guam or whatever. Okay, so it takes the numbers down a little bit. Okay. Okay, so questions so far? This is So Ricardo and Rashab, you may recall, we did things that are very, very similar to this in previous classes. So anytime you're taking something lower levels and aggregating it up or the inverse direction, you have to do a lot of different groupings and merges and things like that just to kind of get everything coherent on similar levels. Okay. All right. So are we ready?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So this is kind of like round one, okay, of where we're at. So basic idea here. Actually, excuse me, we're going to go ahead and calculate the top level prediction too. Okay, so what we're going to do here, a few different ways you can do this, but in this case, what we're doing is we're going to take our test predictions, group it by the dates, and then sum up the total predicted values, and that'll give us the aggregate predictions. All right, so if we look at this, and then the final prids, right, are just kind of, right, taking the test set, grouping by the date and y and summing that up. So we should pretty much have, basically two different data frames that go from September 15th to September 30th with the total predicted values and then the actual values themselves day by day. Okay, so this is kind of going from the aggregate to the top. All right, and so the idea then, right, we take this right over here, divide the total amount of error by, this is actually, excuse me, a little bit of a mistake here. I apologize about this. You'd want to take ag prids and then replace it with final vowels. Okay, so right over here, replace this value right over here with this one right over here like this. Okay, so I'm sorry, this was a small clerical error, so my apologies. So what percent of the actual values were the errors off by? Okay, and so same thing, we have this. And then if you take the average of this, and again, go ahead and then swap out for ag prids, put in final vowels like this, and that would give you the MAPE in aggregate for the entire test set. Okay. In my opinion, we're actually on slightly shaky grounds with this. Overall, we're on average, we're actually off by about 50%. It could be different if you, I don't know what the values look like if you swap out ag prids for final values. They probably look a little better. I'm not sure by how much though. I'm gonna guess not drastically, but maybe a little bit.
Actually, significantly better, at least for me.
Okay, what's the new number?
So we're off by 35% on average.
Oh, okay, all right. That's actually, that's actually a good bit. That's actually pretty soon. It's not like, okay, all right. Okay, so if you swap, okay, so actually we have our top level forecasts are not so bad. Again, though, the individual level forecasts are somewhat shaky in different ways. Okay. All right. So thank you. All right. So this is kind of first pass over, right? How you do this, right? So build the individual forecasts, take the predictions. You have to do some reshaping of your data set, right? And then calculating an error metrics and then sort of weighting it for how much each one contributes to the entire state. And then we aggregated it together. Okay. And then luckily the values there were actually a good bit better, off by about 35% versus 50. We could still probably do a good bit better. Like I would actually probably shoot for something closer to 10%, or 5, but whatever, right? This kind of first pass. Okay. So the idea then, right? This is starting from the bottom and then sort of bubbling it up to the top. Okay. This is where we're going to go ahead and then go into the lab. Okay. So the idea here, the lab is going to ask you 3 basic questions and just sort of ask you to work through them in different ways. And so what we're going to be doing, okay, so we're going to go ahead and sort of swap these numbers out for the actual unique values of the states themselves, right? So the top level accuracy would be about 0.35, I guess, not 0.58. But the lower level accuracy was about 0.51, all right? As of now, this does not quite stack up to what we're doing with the top-down approach. With the top-down approach, we were getting forecasts. Actually, when we actually just looked at the top-level forecast, we got an MAPE of about 0.1 in earlier classes. And then when we sort of did different rules for grouping, we got the group-level forecast down to about 0.3. Okay, so as of now, right, without any sort of additional modifications, we're not quite there. But of course, there are some changes and some improvements we can go ahead and then make. All right, and then one of the big benefits about low-level forecasts is you have a lot more choice for how you might want to go ahead and then modify things. Okay, because we can actually tweak each of the individual states, things like that, and so make better improvements. So let's take a quick look here, everyone. Let's kind of go over next state. Next. All right, so let's do this. Let's take our proportions, multiply by the mean average percent error, and then sort values, and then do sum right over here. Let's take a look at what we have. All right, any idea what this is telling us?
Gives you the states of the largest error on top.
Yeah, and then sum. So basically, yeah. So the proportional weight of the mean average percent error every single state has, we're sorting it from top to bottom. And then does everyone see here sum, what it's doing? It might be useful to remove it and look at the changes in the values that you're seeing. Okay, so it stands for cumulative sum. All right, it is actually a very, very useful operation to do for things like this. Okay, so essentially what this is doing, okay, the first two states right over here accounts for a total 10% of the cumulative error, and so on and so forth. So basically, if you start with Texas and go down to Florida right over here, that actually accounts for a good portion of our weighted error that we have right over here. So effectively, sort of what percent of the total do each of these have? All right, and so the idea then, this is sort of tell you how much of the overall pie are we sort of like getting out of here when we actually sort of rank things in this total value and sort of just take the sum running from top to bottom. So sort of like we look over here at the very, very bottom, you should have something that sort of like tapers out around 0.51. And so if you look at the first 6 states, you know, we can see about half of that is just by taking a look at the states Texas through Florida right over here. So if you just to kind of think about sort of like how much of an improvement can we make by targeting different states in terms of our low-level forecasts, this would be an informed way to take a look at it. Again, if you sort of redid things with the final vowels, these numbers might look a little bit different. But essentially, what percentage of the overall total do sort of the different states occupy when taking a running total of them? Okay. So just in terms of, you know, at what groups of states should we look at, and then how much could we expect to sort of improve things by improving individual forecasts, this would be an informed way to take a look at it. Okay. All right. How's everyone doing? Welcome, Edwin, by the way. Nice having you here.
Hey, Jonathan, thank you. How are you?
Hey, beautiful. All right. So everyone, so questions so far. Let's just kind of see where we're at. Anything that's... Okay. All right. So what we're going to do here, let's take a look at the lab. All right, if we have it. All right. It's in the Slack channel if we haven't gotten it so far. All right. And so the basic idea behind this, all right, we're going to go ahead and just kind of take this as a starting point and just answer a few additional questions, all right, to maybe improve what we have here. All right. So if we look over here. All right. Do we have the lab here? Hierarchical time series, bottom up lab?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, all right. So what we're gonna do here, it's just gonna ask you to sort of rehearse some of what we did previously. All right, so basically it's gonna ask you three different things. So first one, if we look at state PRIDs, okay, something you should notice, some of these values are negative, okay, which is obviously not really coherent, right? You can't have negative 147 people. Actually, maybe you could, depending on how the states kept records, because sometimes they do subtract values retroactively. So if you wanted to be a bit more careful, you could sort of go back and sort of make note of that or things along those lines. But as a general rule, right, you can't have any less than 0 cases when it comes to these sorts of things. Notice here real quickly, everyone, let me bring everyone's attention to something. If we look over here at the function for build hierarchical forecasts, this is kind of going to go back to class 1, where we talked about setting caps and floors for predicted values. And so we basically said there's not really going to be a predicted value above 100,000 or below 0. Profit will follow that, but it's not absolute. It just sort of uses a rough smoothing function to kind of clip the values. But it doesn't mean things will necessarily absolutely always be less than 0. Okay, and so we see that here for some states with lower case counts. All right, we have some negative predicted values. And so if you look at a few of these, so things like we have them in Arizona, Arkansas, I believe there are some in Utah and Wisconsin. Okay, those are obviously invalid values. Okay, and then, so the first question is, if you just take the negative values, okay, and then switch them out to 0, what will the improvement in your accuracy be? Okay, that's just the basic idea. It's just kind of going through the weighted calculations. Like, so we have kind of like these top level values, right? The top level forecast has an MAP about 0.35, and then the aggregate forecast are about 0.5. If we just take those negative values and then set them to 0, okay, how does that improve the accuracy? Just kind of go through that final round of calculations. Second, just so you know, is there's actually a consistent pattern where you have some of these negative predicted values. If you had a really, really big spike fairly recently and then a fairly sharp decrease, profit only fits the first 80% of the time series. So if we remember, let's take a quick look. Just as a quick kind of refresh our memory here, when we look at the top level forecasts, let me see if I can find it. This one right over here, remember we looked at our predictions, and if you recall, this is the true number of COVID cases, and then this were the predicted number of COVID cases. And so it's the case where for some states, if you had a fairly recent big spike and then a sharp drop off, right around the cutoff point, profit just kind of takes them and just sort of like keeps on just like shooting downward a little bit. And so you get some invalid values there, right? So just if you take those, clip them to 0, how does that change your numbers? All right. Second question it asks. All right. We talked before about the change point range. So the basic idea, right, if we go back over here, right, so same thing, we don't really pick up the most recent portion of the time series. And so because this is a very shallow time series with a lot of very, very recent dramatic changes in trend, the idea then is when we initialize profit inside this build hierarchical forecast function, if we take a look at it, actually I overshot, excuse me. If we look over here, this function right over here, okay, so effectively when we initialize profit right over here, in addition to just doing change point prior scale and setting it to 0.25, change point range to 0.9, just to see if getting more of the most recent time series tends to help with some of like the more erratic recent values. Okay, so same thing, make that change, see how it calculates the results. And then the third question it asks you to work through is just take a particular state that looks like it might be a bit troublesome and then see if you can go ahead and then get a better forecast for it. Okay, so obviously at this particular step, you could probably spend as much time as you wanted to tweaking individual states, right? But looking at where we left off, let me go over here, right? With the line that said with the cum sum. Excuse me. So looking at something like Texas or Utah or something like that, right? Or Wisconsin. So basically the most problematic states, okay? Just try and see if you can go ahead and then fit one of those individually and then see how it would change your forecast. Like if you look at actually almost, I think something like 30% of all cases in the tests that happened in Texas, so a 10 to 15% improvement in forecasting cases for Texas will actually have a fairly large impact on everything else, so it's possible there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in making Texas work better. This would relate back a little bit to the first class. So if you remember, when we just started working with the top-level forecast for COVID-19, and so things like the change point prior scale, and then we also use the cross-validation module as well as the validation. So basically taking that all over again and then using it for Texas and then replacing your predictions with that one. Again, take a look, go through the steps of calculating the error and go from there. Okay, the idea is these are reasonable tweaks we could make to go ahead and then improve our numbers. Okay, and that's what lab is going to do. Okay, any questions for anyone so far? And I'm just thinking, Tyler, I do remember you from previous classes because I remember your body language, right? Because I kind of like looking at you now when we were kind of going over everything. It's refreshed my memory having you in class when you go over the ML workshop. So now you're no longer just some random stranger that showed up in the workshop. You're a familiar face again. All right. So questions, anyone? Okay. All right. So real quickly here, if you look at the slides. It actually walks you through some of the answers, okay, for recalculating things. So if you get stuck somewhere, you can just go ahead and take a look at that. Only thing I would point out, just so you know, if you remember some of my error calculations, remember it was incorrect because I was using agprids versus the final vowels. So some of the final metrics are probably not going to work out correctly. I'll try and correct that while we're working on it. But if you just want the basic steps to kind of go through, you can go and work with that, but your final values shouldn't match mine. They're probably going to be better because I was not using the correct ones, okay? But in any event, because the first two questions are fairly concrete, their answers for that. The final one is a bit open-ended and ambiguous. So that one is open-ended, but I will have something here for the end of class for the third question. And so that's what we're going to work on. We're probably going to give it about 1 hour or so, just so you know. So the idea is there'll be about a 15 to 20 minute break built in, and then 45 minutes or so just to kind of go ahead and work on things. I'm going to go off camera. I'm also going to stop recording. So if you want to go ahead and then bring yourself back on screen, that you can. And so any questions you might have, feel free to put them in the Slack channel or in the chat over here, and then we'll take it from there. Okay, questions, anyone? All right.
Okay.
Tyler?
Yeah, I think I'm good. If I run into anything, I will let you know though.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. My camera's going to be off, but I'll be here, right? So you're just kind of going to go through the same steps, just making some tweaks. And then the big idea here, some of the actual operations to sort of go through these error metrics and projecting things, going down and going up and things like that. Honestly, the first couple times you do it, it takes a while. It's not, it requires a little bit of practice. So I wouldn't be surprised if it goes a bit slowly at first. So I will probably check in about a half hour, see how we're doing, and then we'll go from there. Okay. And then Ricardo and Edwin, I know here we are coming from behind a little bit. If you want, I can just give you the notebook if you want to take a look at it from the first half of class, just kind of run through things and then see if that can go ahead and then catch you up. But I'm happy to sort of answer any additional specific questions you might have.
Okay, that will be good if you send the notebook.
Yeah. So you should just be able to run the lines because it connects from the internet and just kind of go through things individually and then just sort of run through that and see where you're at, and we'll go from there. Okay.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Thanks.
Yep. No problem. All right. So give me a minute. So just to go ahead and then record, to go ahead and go over the lab right over here. So basically, right, 3 questions. What happens if we just kind of clip the negative values and make them 0, which is kind of a common sense thing to do. And then secondly, what if we change one of the parameters to basically incorporate more of the time series into the data, right? Because the basic assumption is we look at the first 80% to avoid overfitting. But since COVID data is very, very shallow, it might be a sensible choice to sort of go a little further into it. And then finally, right, one of the big benefits of bottom up is you can actually look at your individual forecasts and then change them in various ways. And so what we'll do here is take a look to see what kind of dent we can make if we go ahead and take a look at one of the bigger contributors to the overall forecast and see if we can improve that ourselves. So let's go ahead. All right. So am I presenting? I forget. Sorry. Can you guys see my screen? No, probably not. No. Okay. All right. All right. Let's go ahead and take a look. Okay. Now we can see, right?
Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, all right. So working through this, right? So the idea is this is, obviously a predicted number of COVID cases can't fall below 0, assuming everything's being counted normally here. All right, so if you take a look over here, if you look at test predictions, it's not a huge number of values, and the values themselves are fairly small. But at the same time, though, 111 values actually show as being less than 0. So it would make sense, right, just to go ahead and then sort of clip these to make them non-negative. So take a look real quickly, just to kind of a quick. It can take a little bit of time just to keep track in your own head. Maybe where these values, what they refer to, and how to keep track of your variables. But if we go over here, okay, so this is DF test, right? So the idea is September 16th through September 30th, individual states, and then the values for Y, the number of positive cases. We are just making a copy of that, so that way we can just kind of go ahead and do more calculations on this one. And so big thing, right? So what we're doing, if you recall, this case, right? Yours probably should have the prediction value right over here. Excuse me, I actually haven't gotten that far in my own notebook. Let me think. I can probably find it over here. Give me 1 minute. Right, you probably have something like this with the prediction column like this. So the idea is this is what we want to go ahead and then set to 0, right? And so that's what we're doing in this line. So just sort of saying, wherever, right, the value prediction is less than 0 in the prediction column, take that and just set it to 0 right over here. And then all we really have to do is just rerun the same calculations all over again. Only difference, if you look at this in previous slides, I'm just changing the numbers right over here, right? So wherever it was DF test, I'm changing it to DF test 2 right over here. And so recalculating the new errors during the grouping. And so same thing. Dividing these by the state totals and then dropping the problematic column right over here. And so what we see, okay, we'll rerun these values, so MAPE multiplied by the proportions. We get something that is very modestly better, but overall not too much. Basic idea is even though these values maybe aren't very coherent, they don't really move the needle too much because wherever it was predicting negative values, they were probably small to begin with, so they just weren't really contributing over too much to the overall total. So in the states, right, where we're maybe getting 3, 4, 6, 8,000 cases per day, we're kind of in that ballpark, and so this makes a small improvement, but nothing that's going to be that large. All right, I would still do it, right, just to make it more coherent, but it's not like it's going to make any of our top level metrics that much better. All right, questions? Okay, good. All right. Okay, beautiful. All right. So second one is a bit more involved, and this is basically just saying, what if we fit 90% of the time series versus 80%? Again, the idea is it's usually prudent to try and avoid overfitting. But in this case, our time series is so shallow, we already don't have enough data really to sort of make full use of profit and sort of understanding the different time components. So there's maybe a logic, right, to being a bit more aggressive with how much of the data we fit. And so in this case, the idea is instead of fitting 0.8, changing it to 0.9. All right. And so basic idea here, right, taking this function, the one that we had before, all we're doing, right, is so for the change point range, we are changing it to 0.9 versus 0.8 and then rerunning it that way. Okay, so taking this function, rerunning these lines, a lot of what we're going to be doing here is just redoing the same calculations over and over again, just with some different parameter changes. So same thing, df train state, change point range is 0.9 instead of 0.8. And really, if you were to look at these lines, they are very similar to what we had previously. Okay, so we're just kind of changing some variable names, but the idea is getting our set of predictions where, you know, after September 15th, reshaping the data set using melt, merging it back into the original test set right over here, and then, sorry, excuse me, we're melting it right over here, clipping the negative values to 0, which would have to be more accurate, even if it's maybe not that important in the big scheme of things. And then same thing, just for convenience, creating the new version of the test set, just so when we remerge, we don't have to worry about dropping any additional columns, right? Combining everything, so that way, right, the big idea behind the merge okay, is something I don't quite have right over here. Real quickly here, excuse me. I apparently got this one. Let me go. Hold on, everyone. Sorry, everyone. Right, just a big thing, right? It's just nice, right? So we have Y prediction and error all in the same column right over here, so we can do comparisons row by row. All right, so we're doing the merge right over here, right? Calculating the error, getting the total error for the states, and then dividing it by the state totals. So again, we do this, dropping this one because, right, it's the nuisance column that we don't really need anymore. And then the crude average, right, is about 0.62, which is really not that different. Okay, and then if we go ahead and then take the weighted MAPE, we're really kind of cruising at about the same altitude by and large. So on a state-by-state basis, it might make an improvement, but for all 50 states as a whole, it doesn't really seem to change too much. All right, so effectively, we could probably just drop this because it doesn't really do anything. So for the data set as a whole, there's really no huge benefit to going from 0.8 to 0.9. The third question that we had was just taking a look at some of the individual states to see if we can improve that. If you recall previously, let me go back over here. When we looked at this idea right over here, so just kind of looking at the weighted MAPE, right? The total values summed up to about 0.51, and Texas accounted for about 10% of this. So among our weighted error, about 10% of that can be attributed to Texas right over here, all right? So if we were to look at a good place to kind of improve our predictions, Texas would be an appropriate place to go ahead and start. Okay, the idea is if we wanted to, we could take a look at Wisconsin, Missouri, Oklahoma, Utah in successive order, and improvements here would have, you know, in sort of, you know, corresponding impacts according to how much they contribute to the overall error. So Texas is in first place in terms of the most important states. So let's just see if we can go ahead and fit that. Of course, if we wanted to, we could take as much time as we wanted to sort of get Texas as perfect as possible. But, you know, this is just a lab just to sort of see how we could go ahead and do this. So we're going to take a little bit of a rewind to the first class. I believe all of you were here, right? So if I'm not mistaken, so we're all here, yeah, the inaugural lesson. Right? This essentially just kind of doing what we did for the first two lessons, just for Texas to make Texas better, okay? So if I have the notebook over here, so real quickly, just want to go ahead okay. Actually, you know what? I can just go ahead and I should be able to go ahead and pull it up right over here. All right. So if you recall, once you fit a model, okay, the additional modules we had over here, cross validation and then performance metrics right over here like this. Okay. So the basic idea, if you remember here, once you go ahead and then you fit a model, you can pass it into the cross-validation function. It's fairly useful for just kind of looking at your CV scores. So same thing, if you remember our validation set, our test set is 15-day horizon. So we're looking at this one right over here. We're saying fit on the first 150 days and then refit every 30 days. And then this variable CV right over here, right, once you're done with this, it looks like this, okay? So the idea is every single date, right, we have the prediction, the actual value, and then the cutoff date right over here. And then what tends to be useful, this is a little bit of a trip down memory lane, right? If you look at this right over here, all right, so essentially what we have here, all right, is for each of the time horizons in the time series, okay, we have various types of error metrics. If you remember for this particular exercise, we're pretty much taking the average of the 15-day forecast and looking at the MAPE. So essentially, if we wanted to map what we have right over here, notice here the horizon is going out 15 days. So if we look at this, okay, and then take the average value right over there. That's essentially the same metric we've been using throughout the class. Okay, are we okay with that same basic idea?
Yeah.
Yes?
There was one instance when it did not throw out MAPE because I think one of the values was 0.
Okay.
So I ended up using MDAPE, which I think is the... I tried looking up what MDAPE is.
On the top of my head, I don't recall exactly what it stands for.
Yeah.
Probably the mean average percent error scaled for something or another.
Yeah.
Okay. It probably wouldn't be too hard after class just to take a close look at it to see exactly what it stands for. So if that were the case,
median instead of the mean, I think.
I'm sorry?
It's the median instead of the mean. So the median.
Okay. All right. Median average. Okay, yeah, that would. I mean, that would probably give you very close results. So
yeah.
All right. So yeah, there's probably switching from one to the other would probably be okay. So if you just got a bad value for it that was difficult for arithmetic, that's probably fine. Okay. Yeah. So it would map fairly well. And then here, Ricardo and Edwin, just kind of a quick. Right, so big thing, right? So we're like our test set is sort of the 15-day as into the future that we haven't tested it on. So here, the horizon goes out 15 days right over here. So all we're just doing is just taking the average value of this column like this, okay? And then that's basically it. Rishab took this one because one of these values were 0, so it made it a bit difficult. But in any event, they would track each other reasonably closely most of the time. So it's probably fair enough to use one versus the other. So the idea then, right, we do this, and this number kind of corresponds to what we've been looking at throughout the class. So for example, when we look at this number right over here, or this number right over here, right, we're taking the average value of basically the average error over 15 days of forecasts, okay? Just other questions people might have so far? And again, we're kind of going back at this point, probably 6 weeks ago, right, to what we looked at with the cross-validation module and things along those lines. Okay. This is not quite, I will repost this after class if anyone wants to take a look at it. I actually didn't have time to put this together before. But again, going back here pretty closely, this is kind of something that was taken from something that was taken really from the first class, right? Basically saying either fitting 80% or 90% of the time series. And then if you remember the change point prior scale, it essentially just tells you how closely should you fit your data, right? So the smaller this is, the general the pattern would be. And then the more aggressive this is, the more Prophet will go ahead and then react to breaks in trend, okay? So eventually, the bigger these numbers are, the more tightly it's going to go ahead and hug the curve. This could be prone to overfitting, but the basic idea is that we have a shallow time series, and then changes in trend in COVID tend to be pretty severe and unpredictable, and everything's happening for the first time. So there's a decent rationale for maybe being a bit more aggressive in terms of how we read from data. So going through each one of these, all we're doing is just kind of going through 2 loops. All right, setting the corresponding values right over here, taking a look at our CV module, and then from that, right, getting the average value for MAPE and then logging the differences. And so when we're done, all right, essentially the combination that gave us the best values were actually fairly aggressive, okay? Fitting 90% of the time series, and then using a prior scale of 0.6, which is well above Prophet's default values. Okay, and then essentially what that tells us, right? So Texas is occupying a lot of the total COVID cases these days, and has probably had some fairly rapid changes in trend fairly recently. And so this just allows us to capture that a little bit better. And so originally, the MAPE for Texas was around 0.4 or 0.42. So we got about a 25% improvement over here. Okay. Questions? Rishab, your numbers might have been a little bit different, but hopefully they roughly agreed in about the same direction.
Yeah, it was pushing me towards. I didn't actually go up all the way up to 0.6. I think I limited my change point prior scale to around 0.5.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. Okay. I mean, I think the basic idea is about the same. It might be interesting to see how far up you could push it before you got diminishing returns, but that's probably fine. 0.6 is actually quite aggressive. So that's probably fine. Okay. Okay. So far before we wrap this up?
Nope.
Okay. Yeah. So basically, if we just do this, setting those particular values, the MAPE for Texas went from about 0.4 to about 0.33. Okay. So we improved that about 20%. And then Texas itself was worth about 10% of the total amount of error in our original data set. So 25% of 10 would be about 2.5%, whatever. All right. So in any event, we do this. And let's take a look. One more thing, right? So now what we're going to do, right? So same function as before. And there is probably a better, more programmatic way to do this. Just so you know, there's probably the best way to do this is if you want to fit your individual forecasts, take an additional argument inside the function right over here and call it something like CVArgs, and then just pass in a dictionary for the particular state that you wanted to use, and then the model parameters and things along those lines. So that way you could just specify an arbitrary number of states and then sort of have this happen for you automatically. But for now, we're doing something that's fairly explicit and just saying if it's Texas, change it to this right over here, right, with the prior scale of 0.6 and then the range of 0.9, and everything else is kind of doing the default that we had from 6 weeks ago. And so the idea is, right, everything else here is about the same. We're just rerunning the same steps and just using different variable names. So we build the forecasts right over here. Okay, so same thing. We recreate the test sets. We do the melting. We merge it back in. We calculate the error, divide it by the state totals, right, and then take the weights. And then basically, if we look right over here, the average value actually goes down a good bit from about 0.6 to 0.5. And then the weighted average also gets a good bit better, goes from about 0.5 to about 0.45. That's still a good bit worse than what we had with the previous approach of just using the top-down forecast. But in this case, it actually did make about a 10% improvement in our weighted bottom level results. Okay. And then if we were inclined, we could do this as much as we wanted with all the additional states. If we wanted to put in enough effort, we probably could actually beat what we were doing with the top level approach, although it would have taken significantly more work because the one high level forecast with the 14-day moving average actually so far had better results than what we're doing with this technique. But in practice, if we were rigorous enough, we could probably kind of go through each of the individual states, find the best way to go ahead and fit everything, and then kind of keep on tweaking that until our results got better. Although up until this point, the top-down approach gives us better bang for the buck in this particular instance. Okay.
Would there be particular instances when you can maybe combine the two models, like the top-down approach?
Yeah. So essentially, the idea is if your hierarchy has multiple levels, you could essentially sort of do them at any particular level. So, for example, Yerushav, if you had maybe something, let's say like national sales, regional sales, district sales, and store level sales.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is maybe going from national sales to all of your individual stores. The 3 layers of separation would be so much that there would probably be a lot of noise by the time you got all the way down to the stores. And so the idea is you could probably do forecasts at either the district or regional level, and then just sort of take each of those and kind of go down or up one level. If I'm being clear.
I think I kind of get it.
Okay. So essentially, it's kind of up to you how you go up or down. Actually, the basic mechanics of it are about the same, where you kind of do the grouping and the merging and the projecting and things along those lines. You wouldn't necessarily have to stop all the way at the top or the bottom. The idea is this particular, the hierarchy we have basically just has 2 levels, Rashab, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have the national data, and then we have the individual state level data. The idea is if you want to sort of combine these in some particular way, you could sort of take some sort of middle level if it existed and sort of use that to shoot up or down.
Okay.
All right. You know what? Probably next time we do this, we're going to look at a different data set, and then it probably will have a few different levels to it. So we can probably look into it in more detail next class, which will be on Saturday.
Sounds good.
Not this Saturday, but following one.
Sounds good.
Okay. Okay, but I guess if there is maybe some sort of way just to sort of do like a rough blending of the approaches, I don't think that's very common, although there's nothing that would stop you from doing it. It's you just kind of picking out sort of what place kind of gives you like the most appropriate way to kind of make your forecasts, and then just sort of going up or going down depending on whatever you think is going to be best for your total results.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like blending models, like generally, like at least at my work, my approach has been that if I'm trying to get at an answer, and this is generally when I have more than one data set that can lead me to the same answer,
Mm-hmm.
I create separate models for those separate data sets, and in the end, sort of like just take some sort of an average approach or blend the models somehow to get a third answer I could not get from either of the 2 data sets and call it a day, which might not be the best approach.
No, actually, so there are actually different ways to combine like different models. So like you can actually take like any of these approaches and kind of get like the top or the bottom level forecasts and things along those lines. So the idea is if you're combining different models into one, so there's the simple averaging, which will actually usually outperform either one all by itself most of the time. So actually combining models is fairly common because as long as they're not perfectly correlated and they explore some different aspect of your data that the other one didn't, it usually will perform fairly well. There are differing levels of complexity to do this. So kind of like the baseline approach is just to take the average and then just call it a day. A second, more involved way of doing it is taking the weighted average depending on how they perform on the validation set. So whichever one kind of gives you the better validation score, use that in proportion to that.
Right.
The fancier way, it's called model stacking. And then this one's a bit more complicated. So what you do is you take your different predictions from your different models, and then you actually use the predictions from your models as their own particular features that you build a model for. So you have prediction 1, and then you have prediction 2 for each of your individual samples. And then what you might have is a 3-column data set, and then you fit a model on that. And that's called model stacking. And that one's a bit more involved, but actually, believe it, if you do that the best way, you can actually get pretty good results. And then the even more involved way of doing that, model stacking, is, remember K-fold?
Yeah.
Yeah. The more involved way of doing this is what you do is, for each of your individual models, you take the blended average of the predictions from each round of K-fold, and then you average those together, and that makes your final prediction. And then you do that for each of your individual models, and then you fit a model on that to make your final prediction. That probably sounds like a word salad. Essentially, you go through K-fold. For each of your individual folds, you make your prediction for the data set, and then you average those together, and that's your final prediction. And then you do that for each of your individual models. And then you have the meta model, which basically uses your model predictions as sort of predictors for your final outcome. And then you model that.
I don't think
it's a lot of additional work. It actually does give you top level results, although whether or not it's worth the additional effort is, if you're trying to win some sort of competitive arms race for kind of getting like that extra 0.5% of, actually it wouldn't even be 0.5% of accuracy. It would be more like, a fraction of a percent of accuracy. It can be useful for it. But, if time is money and things like that, then oftentimes it's not really done. It's actually commonly used in Kaggle to win competitions because it's one of the only ways to actually sort of eke out that additional, third percent or things like that. Probably the more practical approach is if you have different versions of different models, take the weighted average of how they perform on your validation set and go with that.
Okay.
So, if one has an MAPE of 0.35 and the other one has an MAPE of, 0.41 or things like that, you could essentially just sort of like reweight them according to what percentage of the total that they are, and then use that instead. And that's actually probably the more practical approach. That's not really going to take you into some sort of rabbit hole where you're doing lots of mental cartwheels, to get a very, very small improvement.
But in this case, combining the models would probably not be the best idea in this specific sort of like COVID case, because you are sort of like trying to suss out the same features using essentially the same data set. So I don't think...
they would actually infer in different ways. So it's entirely possible you could get better results. Even though they actually are being fit on the same features, they are sort of being derived from different. The source data is exactly the same, but because it's being aggregated in different ways, it's, to me, actually wouldn't be surprised if you combine the two, if you got better results in the two in individual ones.
Okay.
But I wouldn't know. It's actually not. It's not clear to me. I wouldn't know off the top of my head. I don't know if that would be true or not, but it's not. It wouldn't surprise me. Lots of times, blending models together very frequently will give you better results. And then also one other thing, just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea here. If you remember, the top and then the bottom level predictions tend to sort of be, as long as they're inaccurate in slightly different ways, very, very frequently, they'll give you better results. As long as the sources of error aren't sort of fundamentally correlated. Probably a better way to think about this, if you remember at the top level, when we were doing the top-down approach, and the different ways we came up with the proportions, there's probably a very good chance if you blended the results from the forecasted proportions with the simple historical averages, you would have gotten something a good bit better than either one, simply because they were sort of coming in incorrectly from different angles. I honestly, I haven't looked at this close enough to kind of know if blending something like this would give us better results, but it would. It's not inconceivable. All right, questions, anyone?
Nope.
All right. So we will have the next one scheduled up here pretty soon. We're probably going to stay on the Thursday, Saturday schedule. So Thursdays, in the evening, and then Saturday, early afternoon. So it'll probably be sometime towards the middle of October, like October 10th. I'm not, I think the exact calendar in front of me. So probably what we're going to do, we're going to have more of a longer form lab with a different data set, just to kind of work on these things, just sort of without me instructing so much, to get some more practice doing these things. And then that's probably going to go after 1 to 2 more classes. And then after that, we're going to go into the profit deep dive and just sort of rebuild all these things that we're doing by hand to kind of get that deep level understanding of how it actually works.
Sounds
All right.
good. Yeah.
Beautiful, everyone.
Jonathan,
All right. Yeah, Edwin.
did you uploaded the last 2 videos?
No. I'm sorry. I'm thinking I should edit the videos, but I don't have time to do it. Probably what I should do is I just upload the videos and then just post them to the Slack channel so people can just look at it.
Yeah.
And just be imperfect that way. Okay, so I'll be less of a perfectionist and just kind of upload the videos and just share it that way.
Okay.
Because that's better than no one seeing them at all whatsoever. So, okay. All right. So I'll make sure to go ahead and do that. Thank you for your patience, Edwin.
All right. Thank you.
No problem. All right. Anyone else?
No.
All right, then. We will call it a wrap. And until the next time, okay?
All right.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.